Okay, so welcome everyone. We are with John Marks and we're happy to have him on the podcast. We've already had a previous conversation quite recently, and you could tell me or us if we're wrong, John. So it was difficult to kind of label you throughout your, quite long career. You're a peace builder, social entrepreneur, and from what I can see, New York Times bestselling author, and also a former US diplomat. I'm sure there's other things that we could talk about during our conversation. But your life work looks like it's really been all about transforming how countries and individuals deal with conflict. Would you say that's correct?
I believe that is correct. I've had a checkered career. An American television host said I went from provocateur to peacemaker.
Actually, this is a good segue. So thank you for reminding me about that. So you exposed abuse at the highest levels of what I could see in the CIA. And from there, you went to become a peacemaker across the world. How did that come about?
Well, I got to the point in my life where I saw that the work I was doing was being defined by what I was against. And I had no compunctions about being against some of the abuses that were being committed with war, with intelligence, and the like. But I saw that I wanted to be for things rather than against them. And rather than tear down the old system, I wanted to build a new system. And that transformation, which I'm talking to you rather glibly about, but took me about 3 or 4 years to get through. And that transformation got me from provocateur to peacemaker.
Yeah, it is beautiful to see that, and especially at the times today where we are, and rightly so, angry and unhappy with lots of things that are happening in the world, but we are from what I can see, we are not really getting far away with the anger and this emotion coming from trauma, but rather there must be a better approach that we can employ, and I think what you're doing and what I see that you're doing is one of those things, the different, more collaborative, more peacemaking approaches.
Right. Well, my basic premise was that there had to be a better way to deal with conflict and that violence was not inevitable. Now, that's a hard position to hold on to right now in the world because the world seems to be going in the other direction, but I still hold it. And it's very important to me that I stay, if you will, optimistic. You don't start an organization called Search for Common Ground if you're a pessimist. And I do have that optimistic strain, and it's getting harder and harder to hold on to it, but I still maintain it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. For all the years of all of the peacemaking and mediation and conflict resolution, sometimes you must be thinking, why do I bother? But it's not that you didn't have impact. It's just that there's never been more need for the kind of amazing social impact that you've been, doing with your company. And tell me if I'm wrong, your company went from 0 to like 600 staff in 35 countries? And did you plan that to happen, or was it just some natural progression of you kind of scaled up peacemaking, it sounds like?
Well, I saw, and working very closely with my wife, Susan Collin Marks, who was my partner on this, we saw that we couldn't do it alone. If we stayed sole practitioners or in a staff that only had a few people in support, that wasn't going to be world-changing, earth-shaking. And we decided that we had to grow. And that was a tough decision to make because the work certainly was not as much fun with 600 people as it was with, say, 5 or 6 people.
I bet. Yeah.
Let's just say there were bureaucratic requirements, there were administrative needs, there were compliance, and there was compliance. And that kind of thing was a conscious decision on our part. And I think it was the right decision, but in the end, it drove me a little crazy.
And two things we're curious about, because Mira was reminding me just before we started this recording that, like us, we are romantically involved. We're lovers, and also, in your words, because I was looking at some of your research, and this is the way that you put it, but you're also business partners as well. And that's what, we've been doing for years. So I'm really curious to know, how did you pull that off? Because you've been, happily married for 25 years and you've grown this huge business. It must be tough, right? There must be challenges in doing that. Yeah.
Well, my wife and I, let us say, brought different talents to this particular endeavor. She was more heart-centered. I'm more in my head. Let's just say we complemented each other rather well, and we never ran out of things to talk about. We would talk incessantly about what was going on. And she had better instincts than I did in certain ways. And my skill is not in mediating and being in front of a room or anything like that. It's kind of in being an impresario of conflict resolution, of putting things together, of making things happen. And I didn't have to get in front of a room, and I didn't have to mediate, or I knew to bring in the right people. Sometimes it was my wife, sometimes it was other people. We had a lot of consultants working with us too. But my skill was sitting in the room and listening and seeing possibilities, and then being able to move them forward.
Mm.
Wow. What an amazing gift to be able to do that, to be able to, sit in the background, but just absorb things. And then, through that reflection, know what to do next. And I'm guessing that growing a company of that kind of scale, which is a non-for-profit as well, which has an extra level of challenge, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure you had to step up in terms of your leadership skills as well, right?
Well, it worked for whatever reason. And I don't think it would work today if we were starting over, because let us say back when we started, the world was much less bureaucratic. The funders were much less into long reports, compliance, showing where every last penny was going, that kind of thing. But gone are the days when you could walk into an embassy and describe a really interesting program and have them walk out with a check or promise of a check. And that doesn't exist anymore. We were at the beginning of the field, if you will, of international conflict resolution. But right now, there are so many players and the like that it probably would not be possible to take the kind of approach we did, or to experience the kind of growth.
Yeah, got you. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a question in mind and it just disappeared. And I'm waiting for it to come back. But John, you wrote a book recently, and you do talk about how to be a social entrepreneur. What sorts of things one could employ in order to do this job in a way that it's sustainable, in a way that it's impactful, and in a way that is personally satisfying, because there is lots of challenges in social entrepreneurship. So I was kind of interested on, what are the biggest challenges that people are experiencing now? Because I know you're mentoring as well social entrepreneurs at the moment. So you are really in the trenches. You see what is going on. So what are maybe the biggest obstacles, biggest challenges, and how can people deal with them in a better way?
Well, you mentioned that I worked in the nonprofit sector, and one of probably the biggest challenges getting the money, getting the resources to do the kind of work that I wanted to do, and to get long-term money. Unfortunately, funders seem to have a very short memory, and they're always looking for exit strategies and the like. And the kind of work that we do necessitated being engaged for a long period of time. It took a long time to build up the confidence that you could work with people and the like. And it meant being engaged in ways that sometimes weren't showing specific results, but just being engaged as being engaged. And that kind of approach, let's say, does not fit the needs of most funders in the international area. And that was a big problem. Another problem, another challenge was dealing with our own internal bureaucracy. As we grew, it became more complicated. There were more layers. When we started out, I knew everything that was happening in the organization. I liked that. And then suddenly, as the leader of the organization or the co-leader of the organization, I didn't know everything. And I had to learn to deal with that. And I kind of saw that every time we doubled in size, we needed to reinvent ourselves. I'm not sure that was a hard and fast rule, but it seemed to be. And that's just the way it was.
It's interesting. I think we also work with startups, with startup founders, and it seems like there is this idea that there is one way of how you should do things. And this is how you start a business, and this is how you build a business, and this is how you scale. But what you just said, I think is quite congruent with our own experience, is that there is no one way. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different skills, different experiences of life. And you need to reinvent yourself. You need to reinvent the way that works for you. And take other people on that journey. That's some kind of personal transformation as well, isn't it?
It is. I took a maxim from Napoleon, who said, "On s'engage, puis on voit." One becomes engaged, and then one sees possibilities. And to be engaged, you need to be engaged. You need to be able to start. But most funders don't see that as a very good way of operating. They want to know what your results are going to be, what your strategies are going to be in advance.
Yeah.
And if you knew exactly, you might not even want to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's amazing that in that impact space in social entrepreneurship, and they're getting too businessy, right? And actually, what you said there, it sounded like that's one of the principles in your book, right? Because I haven't finished the book, and thank you for allowing me to read it. Usually, I would absorb the book and then we would talk about it, but we had such a short time scale, after meeting you. But we were actually flicking through it this morning, and we were looking at those principles that you're sharing with the world. So let's go back to the book a little bit. Why did you write another book? Because I know you've had this will be your fourth or fifth book,
I wrote it because, after I stepped down from the leadership of Search, I didn't have as much to do. So one thing is that if writing the book filled the time, but I also really wanted to leave behind a legacy. And I wanted people to know some of the things that I discovered. And I felt that writing a book was one way of doing that. So, and I felt that I had learned a lot. I did the work at Search for 32 years. And in the course of that, every once in a while, I learned something. And that was an important insight that I had something to share. And that's one reason I'm going all out to try to make it, have as many people read it as possible. Because some of the things I've learned have already been forgotten. And, people get on with their work. My old organization has new ways of operating and doesn't pay so much attention to some of the older ways. And, I wanted to get it all out. And I'll tell you, two of my biggest discoveries and things that I was doing uniquely that I would like the world to see were, one, we made extensive use of the media and Search became its own television, radio, and internet production house. And we did what we called soap opera for social change, about 350 episodes in 18 countries, that kind of thing. And I wanted people to know how you did that. And the other area where I think we made very much our own path was in working on a societal level. Most of the conflict resolution mediator people work on an individual level. In other words, there are three people in the room, the mediator and two others, and they mediate, and that's a good thing to do. I'm not saying it. But we were looking for ways to take it out to whole countries at a time. And that was quite important. And in a place like the Congo, the DRC, we were able to do that. We were able to reach millions of people with our programming. Burundi was another place we were able to do that, and Macedonia. And those were lessons I wanted to share. That was very important to me.
Yeah, there is way in which... and how did you come to that idea to do it that way?
Go back to what Napoleon said, "On s'engage pour y avoir." I didn't start with all those ideas. I didn't understand how to do this, but I got on a path of being engaged and then seeing more and more possibilities. And I always tried to be flexible. That was big. Because I would read a newspaper article, and that would trigger an idea in me that there was a possible program. We wound up going into West Africa because I got a call from the Dutch Foreign Ministry saying, would we be willing to replicate the radio studio we had done in Burundi and Liberia? And that seemed like a good idea at the time. It just hadn't been my idea.
Yeah.
But just because the idea came from somebody else, I was open to recognizing and acting on it. And given that the Dutch were willing to pay for what they were suggesting, and we saw no problem about going ahead because it was totally consistent with our vision and with what we had done before. It just wasn't our idea. And we picked up on those too. And sometimes it was by accident. Sometimes somebody came to us with a suggestion. But that was the origin, not some planning process. And I found that planning processes were not particularly helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
They were not unhelpful.
Yeah.
And sometimes you could get a good idea from them. But to base how the organization moved forward on a planning process seemed to me a bad idea. I think the Soviets learned that with their 5-year plans.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you talk about plans because, we couldn't agree more. Even in our work, whether it's impact companies or for profit and purpose, we instill in leaders and leadership teams and teams in general to have some plan. But we need fluidity. And as you talked about, flexibility and the fact that if the plan has to be parked to one side, you don't need to grieve. It's okay because the opportunities that come in the future, you might actually squash them down by having such a tight plan around it, right? And from what you've said, it sounds like it's more of a collaboration when you don't have a tight plan. Is that right? Because you've said you can ride off other people's ideas. You're collaborating with a group, with as you said, a country, rather than doing it, one-on-one or just a small team. You're seeing the possibilities for a whole country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is something where you be willing to open to other people, but it's not the same group of people. In other words, it's not that you have a plan, at least in our case, that we had a planning committee out of which these ideas came. Sometimes they came out of the blue. Sometimes they came from a newspaper article. One time, a friend of mine said, if you're a good conflict resolution you claim to be a conflict resolution person, you're letting the killing go on in Burundi. Why don't you do something? And 3 weeks later, Susan and I were on an airplane to Burundi, and we opened up what became our biggest project because of essentially that challenge had been issued. Now, I don't think you can run a whole organization forever on that kind of basis. In other words, the kind of thing I'm describing seemed to work much better with startups or first-generation leaders. And after that, sometimes the bureaucrats need to take over. In other words, you need to put in place systems. As you grow, you need it, and a lot of rules and regulations. A friend of mine at Harvard Business School put it this way, that there are two main styles of management. On the one end, you have adaptive management, which is what I'm talking about, where you're en s'engage pour y avoir, where you engage when you see opportunities. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have management by rules. And you need to find a balance between the two. It's not going to be 100%, even in the case of the craziest social entrepreneur. There have to be some rules, but you don't want to be burdened with them. But usually it seems when the founder steps down, it moves much more towards the rule side of things. And that's the experience. I'm an awardee, a fellow of the Skoll Foundation. And we talk a lot to other social entrepreneurs. And most of them have had the experience when they step down, they don't like their organization so much as they did in the beginning.
Yeah, because it evolves, right? And things change. And I mean, well done, because you've done some amazing work. That, as you said, at scale, yeah, it becomes less fun because it's a lot more about management. There's a lot more systems, there's legal stuff, there's framework, but it has to be there, right? When it gets to a certain scale.
Absolutely.
But it sounds, yeah. So if that's the case, I mean, because you've said that in your career, things have shifted, maybe sometimes not for the better. So for people listening now who want to start an NGO and they've got fire in the belly and they know they can have impact, what would you say to them starting out? And I know obviously we can talk about the 11 principles, but is there anything that stands out? If they were going to do it today, or if you were going to do it today, what would you do?
Well, it's not going to be easy, I want to tell you.
Yeah.
And when you are a social entrepreneur, you're the float in the organization. That is to say, you're the only one who will work without pay, probably. You're the only one who's going to be committed to going ahead no matter what. And you probably need that kind of idea. Now, it helps a lot if you start out with a pot of money. In other words, if you can guarantee or make sure you can get through the first couple of years, because they are going to be the toughest. And having some money, or having a girlfriend or a boyfriend who wants to support you or something, is not going to hurt you at all.
Yeah.
And you better be open to taking what some people would think is charity. If there's a parent who'll be supportive, fabulous. In my case, I guess it was in my first year, my mother died, and which is very sad. I mean, no one wants to lose a parent, but she left me a little money. And my father told me that I should invest it in stocks and bonds. Think about the future, he said. And I said, I want to invest it in my vision. And I did. And during the first year or two, when I wasn't being paid my salary because it wasn't available in the organization's coffers, I used that money to get through the day, if you will. And my father said I was going to piss away my inheritance. And in fact, I did. It was gone within about 3 years. But it's the best investment I ever made in my life.
Wow, yeah.
Because out of that, I got the thing. And most people are not so fortunate to have such a thing. And there's nothing fortunate about your mother dying.
Of course.
But for me, it proved to be a great stroke of luck. And though I didn't understand that at the time, and, I was sad, but it turned out, I've given you the benefit of hindsight on that one.
Yeah.
Got you. I'm interested to go a little bit further into the future. So talking about your production company, you became an executive producer yourself, right? There was a film called Under the Same Sun, is that right? And what piqued our interest, because it sounds like it's a mockumentary. I didn't even know that was a genre thing until I looked you up. And it's about a Palestinian entrepreneur and an Israeli businessman who form an unlikely partnership. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. We had Search for Common Ground set up very early on something called Common Ground Productions. And we were making our own film and our own television and our own radio. And the film that you mentioned was our first and actually only feature film, because we mostly did multi-episodic television. And it was an Israeli-Palestinian co-production. And as you said, it featured businessmen from both sides who started a solar energy company. And they both got trashed within their own cultures. In other words, for cooperating with the other. And they came to realize after their solar panels were destroyed and they were criticized and these kinds of things, that if there wasn't peace in the region, they couldn't do this kind of work. So they went onto Facebook and they formed a Facebook group calling for real negotiations between the two sides. And hundreds of thousands of people joined, and it forced the politicians into action, and peace broke out between Israel and Palestine. Now, clearly, this was a fable. It didn't happen, and it probably is never going to happen. But our whole idea was to make it, to show a new possibility on this. And the film showed on Israeli television and on Palestinian television. And we tried to do things that worked on both sides.
But it is important, we, as you said, sometimes the work we do, we don't see the results straight away, or we don't see the results in a way that we imagined them. But I'm sure that it did show the possibility to some people. I mean, it's interesting. You know what comes to mind, Peter? There is a restaurant here. We are in Berlin, and in Berlin, very multicultural city, people from all over the world. And some maybe even the least likely partnerships as well. And there is a restaurant here that it's operating for at least 10 years, I think. And it's a cooperation in between Palestinian and Israeli owners, founders. They're best friends, and they started a restaurant that is very popular here. I think they have a few of them now. And so, I think we all... And people like going there. People are attracted to the possibilities of it. I think it's just probably a matter of time when things will work out on a bigger scale, or at least I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, from what we see, and I don't know what you think about this, John, but there's so much negativity out there, and there is, arguably never more conflict in the world. But I guess the kind of people we're hanging around with, because we're doing similar work, we're helping teams with conflict and all of this stuff. And to be fair, our secret is we just don't watch much of the news, or at least the major news outlets, because they're, propagating a certain dynamic. And, we lived in the Middle East quite a long time, and seeing the perspectives from that side was an absolute gift, being able to listen to those different perspectives and then move back to the West and be in Europe. We were like, I'm not really resonating with the BBC anymore, or this or that. Let's just stop watching it. Because let's be honest, we all get to hear about everything in the world anyway because of digitization, whether we like it or not. So it's probably a gift we can all give ourselves, just to stop watching news channels in general. What's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the media doesn't do such a great job, and they emphasize conflict rather than conflict resolution, and conflict is sells. So that's true. I very early on in my career took a maxim that I learned from the New Yorker's press critic named A.J. Liebling. And what he said is freedom of the press belongs to those who own them. And I decided that I wasn't probably going to be able to do much of a job in influencing the mainstream media. They didn't particularly want to be influenced. They didn't like it when people who were trying to make them do things like that. And I set up Common Ground Productions. And in the beginning, it had absolutely no reality. And in fact, the first thing I did was I had cards made, business cards, which said I was the president of Common Ground Productions. Now, the people who make business cards are printers. They don't care about any reality. You don't need credentials or diplomas or all that. All you need is like 50 euros to pay for the card. And so setting that was kind of a declaration that we were in business. And within 3 years, we had our first series on American public television. And that was a start. It worked for me. I don't think that strategy is replicable.
I wish it could in the future. Yeah, it seems like some of the things that it seems more fluid, more natural, your approach.
Instinctive.
Yeah, and things have definitely changed for better or worse. It's interesting, yeah. I mean, going back to, the book itself. So at the start of the book, tell me if I'm wrong, John. So what you were talking about in one of I don't know if it was the first chapter, but you were talking about an unlikely project where former heads of the CIA, the KGB, and the like were sitting around the same table. And this was after, a decade or so after the work that you'd done ousting the CIA and being quite vocal about certain people sitting around that table. Tell us about that, or is that okay to talk about that in the book?
Well, as you said, I wrote a couple of books which were not greeted happily by the CIA. I was a best-selling author. I had my 15 minutes of fame, if you will. And later, one of the earlier projects I got going when I became the founder and head of Search for Common Ground was to find ways that the U.S. and Soviet Union could cooperate. Mm-hmm. And that meant finding things that were in their common interests. And what we settled on was in preventing terrorism. Now, at the time, terrorism was not a big international issue. It was kind of a small issue that there were American experts in preventing terrorism. Nobody on the American side even knew that there were Soviet experts too. The Soviets had said that terrorism was a capitalist problem. It wasn't something that they had to be concerned with. And then they had, I believe, some buses seized and some people killed, and they got into their importance. And since if we found it as an issue that both sides wanted to deal with, and there was an interest in cooperation. So I worked with a Soviet counterpart who was a correspondent at a leading magazine, and he clearly had connections to the KGB because he was related to the head by marriage at the time, a man named Igor Belyaev. And we set up the U.S.-Soviet coalition to prevent terrorism rather grandly. And we started having some meetings, and we were in the right place in the right time. And we wound up bringing together high officials of the CIA and the KGB, retired officials. But clearly on the Soviet side, they had the permission to do this. This was during the Gorbachev days when such things were not out of the question. Yeah. And I was able to bring into it William Colby, who had been the director of the CIA. But on a personal level, I had confronted in front of 1,500 people only a few years earlier for the work that the CIA had done in Chile to overthrow the Allende government. So I was not on his good list, let me say. And I also had written about him in one of my books as doing for horrible human rights violations. But Colby, to his credit, and me to my credit, we decided we could work together on this issue. And he was key in making an agreement, an informal agreement with the Soviets. And we brought them to the United States. We took them to Disneyland. We did all those kinds of things with the KGB people. And out of it came an agreement to cooperate on terrorism. And it became official. It became something that continued. And to this day, there is still some cooperation between the two to prevent terrorism.
It is interesting to me, and I'm hearing it more and more these days, and I think people are learning again that the cooperation is and collaboration is the way forward in the world. I think over the years, after the Second World War, there's so much pull towards individualism. It's all about me, my ego. What have I achieved? What can I get from this? What can I, And so, but I think things are shifting, and you have seen that much earlier, shifting into direction of cooperation. And in order to cooperate, we need to be able to set aside our conflicts, our disagreements, we need to find a common goal, as you said, and we need to have a higher purpose that is higher than ourselves individually in order to do that, because it can be quite uncomfortable. I see lots of companies that also seek us to work with. One of the main things that they say they're missing in teams is a way of collaboration.
No, I agree 100% with what you just said. And us living in Europe, particularly Western Europe, is the model for what could happen in the world. I mean, this is a place where there was a bloody, absolutely atrocious war fought only, 80 years ago. And I'd say the greatest mechanism for conflict resolution, most successful mechanism, is the European Union. In history, in a very few years, brought together France and Germany and Britain, who had been enemies for so long and had fought horrible wars with each other and the like, and it provided a mechanism. Now, I know there's a lot of criticism for bureaucratic overload and stuff like that. But from a conflict resolution point of view, it's incredible that this has occurred, and it shows what could be done in other parts of the world. Now, there are costs to it. People are not on an individual level probably as free to do what they really want to do in the European Union, because there are rules and regulations for everything. And that's a problem for a lot of people. But the alternative, think of the Second World War, the alternative is absolutely horrible. I live in Amsterdam, and I live in what was called the Jewish Quarter. And this is a region where the atrocities were so awful, and it was worse than the Eastern Front. And that's gone. And we have other problems right now, but they're not nearly at the level. I have the view that history is progressing in a positive direction, that the trajectory is positive. Unfortunately, it's not a straight line. There are ups and downs. And even though things are getting better, they're also getting worse. And we have to be not overwhelmed by the downsides. And I wish it weren't so. I wish it would just keep getting better and better and better. But it doesn't happen that way. There's a roller coaster effect or a sine curve effect here.
Yeah, it always looks to us like it's non-linear though, right? I mean, I totally resonate with what you said there, because, there will be rocky roads ahead for sure. And, me being from the UK originally, I'm still grieving Brexit, because we've lived in Germany, or at least I have, for 11 years, you for a bit less. But yes, there's red tape. Yeah, arguably you can't do exactly what you want, but also some of these regulations are actually protecting multiple countries at once. And you could argue that, some people sitting around the table don't get as much, it's not equitable and all the rest of it, but the alternatives prior to the EU being formed is bloody wars and much more conflict and much less safety. And I think, considering what we've seen with Ukraine and Russia recently, I think there's never been more of a need for it. And I'm hoping, even from, being a UK citizen, I would like to see in the future that we rejoin the EU, but that's not part of our conversation. I don't want to sway off and get too political around it. But it's interesting that what you said about there will be more conflicts, there will be lots of precarious things happening in the world. But that's not to say that there's millions of people around the world who want exactly what we've been talking about. They're willing to collaborate. They are listening. and they are prepared for opportunities or what ifs in more of a impactful, more positive light, right? I think we forget that, because I'm even looking at, I made the mistake of watching the news, was it yesterday? And in the UK, there's never been more right-wing populism going on. There's been rioting. But we have to remind ourselves that that's not the majority of what people think. And I think that's the challenge, right? The populism and right-wing behavior in these politics, it's a few, it's not the many. And if we can just remind ourselves that, and people do want a better life, then, maybe that's a way of telling people you don't need to give up. You can still have impact. You can still be a social entrepreneur.
No.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with everything you said. And I would remind you that after World War II, or maybe you don't know about this, that people doing the kind of work that I did in Switzerland, what now called the Alliance for Change, brought together very high-level Germans and French people. And out of that came a strong contribution to the beginning of the European coal and steel community, which became the European Union. But it was track two, unofficial meetings that got it started. And it fit the foreign policy of the various governments. They weren't going against the core, but there was an awful lot of resistance to even talking with French people, talking to Germans and the like. And the mediating force prevailed, and there were visionaries in Europe who, on the French and the German side, who made it happen. But it's extraordinary. And it shows that you can do these kinds of things. And maybe the opportunities were greater then, but at this point, let's say there are always going to be new opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think it's same like, we are humans and we have these ups and downs, and we see things clearly and we don't see things clearly, and we get scared and we act on our fear. And then the same thing, our society behaves. So it's not, but as I said, every conflict can be an opportunity to learn from and grow from and develop from.
Mm.
One of the things that I kind of wanted to go back to your book, I wanted to go baback to your book. We were talking, when we had a chat recently, we were talking about the increased levels of stress and the mental health challenges for the founders and people working in NGOs and social entrepreneurs. And so, and you've been doing this work for a really long time, and you're here with us, and you have big experience. What's your take on it? What have you learned? What worked?
Well, there does tend to be burnout in the social entrepreneur, social activist area. People, and I'm accusing myself here too, get totally obsessed and into their own work. And they have what I would call an Atlas complex. Remember, Zeus tricked Atlas into holding up the sky, and so the world didn't end. And, many social entrepreneurs, many social activists believe that if they stop, the world will end, or the sky will fall, or there was some variation thereof. And so they don't take care of themselves, and they don't work very well. I mean, it doesn't work in the long run, and they experience burnout. Mm-hmm. Now, my secret for avoiding burnout is found in the Japanese martial art of Aikido. In Aikido, if an attacker comes at you, what you do is different than what happens if an attacker comes at you in boxing. In boxing, the whole idea is to knock the person back 180 degrees onto their rear end. And that's the essence. Where in Aikido, you accept the energy, you blend with the energy, and you divert it by maybe 10 degrees or 20 degrees. And that's a way to make both people safe. Mm-hmm. And what I would be doing when I was working in a place with horrible atrocities or terrible violence, I would just accept it as a given and try to divert it by 10 degrees or 20 degrees. It just doesn't work. It didn't work to yell stop, even though I wanted to, even though I was, angry about it and everything else. And by diverting the energy of all this by 10 degrees or 20 degrees, and I did that with my work too. I practiced what I call the Aikido management. I was able to, let us say, not get caught up in it in a way that helped push me toward burnout. Now, my wife doesn't do that. My wife takes in all the violence and the emotion of it, and it wears her down. Me, it doesn't wear me down. It just is an incentive to keep moving. And we can only do what our characters allow us to do. My approach is not applicable to everybody's approach. But one of the principles I list in the book of social entrepreneurship is practice Aikido. I think it works better than a directly confrontational adversarial way.
Yeah.
And it does make sense. There's so much. I mean, I can see with us as well in our experience when we kind of soften towards the hardship or what is getting in our way, when we take the approach, I'll do the best that I can, and not get angry, not get caught. I think anger usually is well, at least my thing, my emotion to get into things, probably coming from war background as well, but not get caught into it and do the best that we can. It does make things different, and it does. And you know what's also interesting, thinking now, I think it opens up different opportunities as well.
It does indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. It goes hand in hand with what I see adaptive way of working, moving things forward. But I'm not sure it's replicable with everybody.
But there, I think, sorry, did you want to?
No, go for it.
I think, going back to our conversation and how we started and things we spoke about, it looks to me that for you, what worked and what you're advocating for is collaboration. We spoke about you growing a company, growing the organization with your wife, and how different you are in your approaches, and combining those approaches. That's why it worked. In different, we're talking about political sides that are different, combining approaches because you have a higher goal, you have a higher desire, you want to do something with that. That's what it worked. Collaborating even with things that really make us increase our stress and gets our blood running, and not confronting, but kind of collaborating with it, taking it in and shifting it in the other direction. That has been kind of core of what we were talking about, at least the way I see it.
Yeah. I would add to what you just said, it was flexible collaborating.
Uh-huh.
In other words, I wasn't collaborating with the same people on every issue. It was ad hoc. When something came up, one would find the ones you needed to collaborate with. I had experience as an investigative reporter before I started Search for Common Ground. And I found I got fairly skilled at being able to separate wheat from chaff and to find a way forward that was useful. And there was in the course of doing that, one needed to discard lots of possibilities because they weren't going to be fruitful. And if you spent all your time or much of your time going down the wrong road, you weren't going to be very successful at it. And that kind of training, it turned out, was very important for being a social entrepreneur.
It sounds like it, yeah. And so it sounds to me, in terms of your background at least, and for many people, sometimes, like you said, if you really planned it and put a tight structure around it, it may not have necessarily grown the way it did, right? And I guess you don't know until later on that all of those transferable skills, life experience, how that's going to be applicable going forward when you grow this kind of impactful company, right? And I know that for us, we've meandered. We've had a checkered history ourselves in our backgrounds, very different. And actually, when we started the company, which was remotely, when both of us were living in totally different ends of the planet, we realized that actually, slowly but surely, some of these things that we did or stumbled on or went through different industries, there was some use for it later on. So it sounds like, it's good to gain some different experiences. So if that said, if you were to do it all again, is there anything that you would do differently? Or you'd just be like, look, you've just got to roll.
Well, I clearly made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes when you do these kinds of things. I made some bad decisions. There were some projects that didn't get off the ground. But for the most part, I had a pretty good track record. And I was open to the fact that there were going to be a lot of failures. And that I wasn't going to let them knock me over, if you will. I figured if like a third of the proposals I submitted were actually funded, or a third of the ideas, the good ideas I had, were actually went forward, I was doing pretty well.
Yeah, it sounds like a good return on investment, no?
Right. And it got a lot easier after I had enough of an organization that I could bring failure in without bringing down the organization.
Gotcha, yeah.
In the early years, I was afraid that if something didn't work, that would be the end. We would be lost. And I was kind of deflecting successes in the sense that I'd be working in the Middle East and things wouldn't be going well.
Yeah.
But I would hear that we were doing great things in West Africa. And that would buoy me to continue to work in the Middle East. I mean, like most people, I liked having success, but I knew I wasn't going to always have success in the place where I was working or that I was committed to at that particular moment.
I think that's a great experience. And it's wonderful, I think, for our listeners to hear that you have to fail, right? You must have that as part of the mix. And I know I don't like failing. Mira doesn't. We all don't. But if you're willing to take a step back, and I know you've done this a lot in your career where you can just listen to, okay, what's the lesson there, And that's it. I think anyone who's been super successful, there's a lot of things that ended up falling by the wayside or like, wish you'd never done that. But you don't need to feel anger or shame around it because there's always some grains of learning in there. But I know it's difficult in social entrepreneurship and impact companies to fail even once, because they're like, I must put in double the amount of hours this week in case it falls over. But then going back to the burnout, that's why these companies don't last very long, right?
Yeah, I agree.
By the way, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you. I know we could go on for hours, but I'm conscious of time. So to wrap it up, is there anything, John, that we haven't covered that you want to share with our listeners or anything you want to say? Any final words?
Look, we've been talking about a career that's gone on for 40 years. We've missed a few things. That's normal.
Yeah.
But, I enjoy these conversations and it's great to be able to share. And it's why I wrote the book, because now I have a chance to have such conversations. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. And it was great meeting you, which is a new relationship and a new friendship. But we should get together in person at some point.
For sure. We're very, we're close enough to do that because quite often with our guests, sadly, we still haven't met some of them in person. It's over the years, it happens, eventually because we're always, we plant that seed, let's see where our paths cross. But with us, at least, we're not far. We're only, Amsterdam, Berlin is doable, right? Versus if you were still in Washington, D.C., it might be a bit more of a challenge, right?
Yeah. Well, I didn't really understand why we were doing a podcast on Zoom, which is all voice. But now I understand because I can see you and we can have some interaction. It's almost like being together. It's still better to be together. But thank you for showing me this.
Yeah. Well, maybe in the future we can make another episode in person. There's always that because quite often our guests came, they come back a couple of years later because as you say, there's always something else to discuss. So, but anyway, thank you for this conversation. It's been really valuable and I'm sure our listeners are going to really be in for a treat. So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.